Hello, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm lucky enough to be speaking to you today from the beautiful lands of the Darkinjung people on the lovely central coast of New South Wales. I'd like to recognise their continued connection to the lands and waters of this incredible place and acknowledge that they never ceded sovereignty, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are listening today. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Brisbane Writers Festival's Author-Illustrator series, where I have the incredible pleasure of talking to amazing people who can create magic with words and images. Make sure you catch up with previous episodes, which are all available online through the Brisbane Writers Festival website. It's my absolute pleasure today to be speaking to Shaun Tan. It's a real privilege, I think, to get to sit down and have a chat with you for an hour and just kind of get some insight into how you actually create your magic, because your work is so kind of iconographic, I guess. Like it's got such presence and identity, and it looms so large in the kind of pantheon of incredible Australian creatives, and that's been recognised through your career. I think if you've got an incredibly impressive list of awards, including an Academy Award, which is not something every children's picture book illustrator aspires to. It's quite a coup. So you won the Western Australian Premiers Award, and you're actually a member of the Western Australian Writers Hall of Fame, I understand, with some incredible literary luminaries. You've won a Hugo Award, the Astrid Lindgren Memorial Prize, the Kate Greenaway Medal, which are all, peak international accolades. And I think your books have been translated into 25 different languages now, or more than?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, so incredible global reach. So not just sort of beloved and, revered in Australia, but also, all around the world. And I think that's a sort of testament to how universally your work resonates with people. I know the first time I saw it, it was kind of a revelation, when you see something that really just inspires you, and it's something that's completely different to anything that you've sort of come across before. I was really interested. I think I was reading a transcript of a talk you gave on your website, and you described your childhood growing up in Western Australia and your sense of place there as being sort of a feeling of being somewhere and nowhere at the same time. And I found that really interesting, because that's the sense that I get when I look at your work. But I'd add everywhere. It's a sense of somewhere, nowhere, and everywhere. Like it's sort of a universal sort of world that you're creating that speaks the kind of the essence of trying to puzzle out your place in the world, and what it's like to be a conscious being in a strange universe.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think you've said that you find strangeness incredibly fascinating, and it's sort of at the core of what you produce. Like that's sort of what drives you.
Yeah, it's almost the motivating trigger to write and draw is, I think that's true of everybody, actually, because I think all fiction is about something intruding on normal life. Something, whether it's realist fiction or science fiction or fantasy, it's about something unexpected happening, and then immediately as a reader or a viewer, we're trying to figure out what to do about it. And we're naturally curious animals. So if we see something particularly entering our normal world that doesn't make sense, we well, there's two reactions. One is to turn away or be fearful, and the other is to ask questions and try and positively engage and think, what can I learn from this? So I'm interested in both those reactions, and I think my books are about both those things, about, because I feel it in myself. I'm so curious, but I'm also resistant to change. Yeah, I'm not a particularly imaginative human being in my normal life.
That's hard to believe.
Yeah, no, really quite boring. But when I sit down and draw and write, somehow that's the entry point to being able to expand my consciousness a little bit. Maybe it's kind of a safe environment for doing that. But it's interesting what you say about my comments about being like a bit, feeling like I'm in a castaway place, you know, on the West Australian coast. I think other people from Perth have said the same thing, so I'm not alone there. And there was a real sense of isolation, particularly when I was starting out as a freelance illustrator. It was pretty tough, and I didn't have a lot of role models, or I was studying, you know, different aspects of visual and literary culture at university, but it wasn't anything like what I'm doing now, and I felt very lost, actually. And so it's interesting to also mention all the awards and accolades, because I kind of spent so much of my early career in obscurity that when I did start to get recognized, I was so used to almost doing this thing where you cancel out any kind of special notice, because you know it's a little bit skewed. You know, you think, no, it seems like special notice because I'm seeing it, but in the wider community, it doesn't. Nobody notices, and I felt that when I would go to publishers and so on, I'd still be pretty obscure. So I was this pressure of obscurity, and that can be a great thing, because it gave me the sort of freedom to just do whatever I wanted. And I've again, with people from Western Australia, I've had conversations about this too, and it's quite a common thing. It's a mixture of boredom and isolation that gives you a great sense of freedom, and not actually, you don't almost measure yourself by other traditions, because there isn't really much point.
It's just sort of somehow untethered.
Yeah. And then you start making your own thing, because nobody else is going to. So my earliest work was with a small magazine called Eidolon, and that was a group of people in Perth who just got together and realized nobody's going to publish us, so let's make our own magazine, just a subscriber only thing. And that went for a couple of decades, and was really formed a great community of writers and illustrators, which is how I got my start. And it was just because nobody else there was no opportunity, so we had to make our own opportunities.
Sort of the whole nature of was a vacuum dynamic. There was and your creativity kind of grew to.
Yeah, and even now, because it was so long like that I still feel like an obscure artist. So it's weird when people say I'm well known, because I'm like, really, you know, like other people read these. You
almost wouldn't want to lose that sense, would you? I mean, imagine if you actually did sort of let yourself look at that side of things, it might become a bit overwhelming and paralyzing.
I think maybe in the world of film and the more social media, that might be a difficult thing to balance. But as you would know, as an illustrator yourself, once you come back into this space, like the little studio, and my studio has always been, this is pretty much how it looked when I was a teenager. I'm working at the same desk I was drawing at when I was 6 years old. It's the same pin-up board from my childhood bedroom, different pictures, but the actual material's the same. And you come back to that little space, and it's almost like everything resets to how it's always been. It's you, a piece of paper, some pens and pencils, and all your own anxieties and inspirations, battling it out to create some work that gives you a joy rather than depression. It's always that struggle, you know, and every artist knows this, you know. It never lets up.
I mean, that's the one of the amazing things about it, really, because, you know, it feels like in your work you're exploring a lot of things that resonate with you personally, and like you said, you were in a particular environment, there weren't that many opportunities, and this sort of arose from you making your own and doing what pleased you, you know, what sort of you know, what do they call it, sort of floated your boat in a very isolated way, in a very small room. But I mean, the interesting thing is how universally people have responded to it. You know, you can take a very, very sort of, you know, the sort of personal vision of one artist, working through, like you said, your anxieties, your depressions, your interests, and then through that you create something marvelous. Because I mean, you know, your work has this real high strangeness about it. And I know that means it's often, you know, people have to categorize things and it gets pigeonholed as, you know, science fiction or fantasy, or, you know, but it almost feels like it sort of transcends those sorts of boundaries and definitions, and that, you know, it's more like a sort of a set of elemental myths or allegories. You know, you're creating a new iconography through the whole body of your work, which is very personal. But then the way people respond to it, that's because it speaks to everyone on a really elemental level, I think.
Yeah, and I guess that's the mystery of it, you know, for me as well, because I often look at the final work and I find it a little bit surprising and strange. Like, it's strange to me, and that's how I like it. That's when I know it's successful. When it doesn't feel like I'm manipulating the marionettes. They're kind of walking by themselves, and then I step back and I see the whole landscape, because often you're working like this. Just one thing at a time, joining jigsaw puzzle pieces.
Solving the next challenge.
Yeah, it's a puzzle that you're doing, and it's very hard to see the big picture. But when it all comes together, there's somehow there's some deeper subconscious intelligence maybe that's giving meaning, universal meaning and sense to this stuff. And then of course you have to do many versions before that kind of clicks, but then you sort of step back and you look at it like it might be a draft of a book or a sketch for a painting, and I start to get that feeling, which I guess readers hopefully get as well, which is that it's a real interesting mix of recognition and strangeness. So something really weird that I haven't seen before, but it feels somehow familiar on some deep emotional level. Conceptually hard to figure out, but emotionally it makes sense. And I love it when that happens. It's pretty rare, but you know, occasionally things click like that. And I know it's a good story or a good image when I like it, but I don't understand it. You know,
well, that's interesting, because that was one of the things that I wanted to ask you. Is, you know, I know, you know, your art's sort of a process of distilling and exploring, and I think you described it as almost a sort of evolutionary process, sort of survival of the fittest, where you're kind of, you know, creating ideas and discarding them, and some of them, you know, the genetic line just doesn't go anywhere, and then so how do you know when you've arrived? You know, what does that feel like?
Well, that's the trick. That's almost like the real skill of being an artist. It's not talent or technical ability. It's that being able to, it's like a good editor or anybody else in their job, whether you're a geologist or doctor or whatever. I think it's the ability to recognize when something's special before you've even figured it out. So I think I don't feel I've improved much as an artist since I was in my 20s, really, but I've gotten better at recognizing the often the really good ideas, strangely enough, are ones that I immediately think are silly, like too silly to bother with, and they're very quiet little whispers. And I've learned to pay attention to them, and I think that's one of the things when I think as an artist, as opposed to my normal day-to-day life, you know, driving around shopping and stuff. When I'm at the table, I'm more listening to those misfires of the brain, like little errors. So even when, you know, in a conversation, somebody says something and you mishear it and it's something funny and we go, ha ha, I misheard it, and you brush it off. I think for me, that's almost the stuff I'm looking for. It's like, oh, that weird accident somehow triggered a series of thoughts there. Like I felt my brain starting to fire, and instead of cancelling out and going, no, steer back onto the road of normal life, you kind of follow up a bit, like when you have a dream. Yeah, like when you wake up from a dream and you think that was a crazy dream, but there's something in it. There's something in it. And so sitting down and drawing is a way of following through. But as you say, often it doesn't result in anything. And so the other part of being an artist is sheer persistence of just you're still mining, looking for that fleck of gold in all the rubble. But yeah, the good ideas are often a bit they seem stupid at first. Oddly, they seem a bit stupid, and because so many ideas are stupid, it's then very hard to figure out which is the good stupid, and that's the problem with originality too, is that it's hard to be original because every single thing that you do is using the devices that you've inherited. Even us talking now, we're using somebody else's language that we've learned. If we did something truly original, it probably would be hard to recognize. So it's trying to find that sort of ideas that are kind of original, but they're still recognizable enough that other readers can make sense of them, that you can have a conversation about them.
So does that come down to taking something familiar and relatable and then twisting it or layering it?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. And and it's not like random waiting for inspiration or finding something. There's fairly simple techniques that I use, because as a professional practitioner, you have to produce. You can't sit around waiting for good ideas to happen. And so I just do a simple exercise of imagining that I'm a Martian anthropologist visiting Earth, and this is a really good thing to do, regardless of whether you work in a genre fiction or something fairly straight. Is you just take any object, something as banal and mundane as an apple, and drawing helps you with this too, drawing and painting, because you have to sit down and you're thinking about an apple for an unusual amount of time, more than is normal. But instead of it getting more boring, it gets more and more interesting. So you start to suddenly get beyond this world of recognition and perceived meaning, and you start to go into, well, what is an apple? Well, it's this thing that swells out of a flower on a tree, but what is that? Where does it come from? And you start to become, whether you're writing about it or painting it, you become more mystified by this thing called an apple, and the word itself falls away. You realize this is an object that existed before names, and it's got this whole history, and then you can research it further and find out that it comes from Kazakhstan or wherever, and and then that can lead you down this real deep kind of path to appreciating something that you never really thought about, something you learned as a kid and then immediately went, yep, I know that. So you can do that with any object, any word, any gesture, any kind of narrative, but it takes time. But it's I think that's what reading, writing, art making is really all about. It's kind of meditating on small things very carefully, and just not assuming that you know what they are.
And it sounds like, by making the familiar strange, you're sort of arriving at a point where you actually have more clarity about its essence.
Maybe, yeah. It's sort of a clarity, but it's kind of a mysteriousness, and it's also acceptance of ignorance too, which brings us. I think it brings some peace to actually appreciate that you can't understand everything around you, and then you look around your whole room and your house and your family, and I guess this is a theme in all of my books, is different versions of what constitutes home, and this thing that's so familiar and we take for granted, but when you stop and think about it, it's pretty weird. And what if we were born in another planet, another time in history, or as another animal? We would still have these feelings, but they'd be attached to totally different people and objects and things.
Well, that's something you did so stunningly in The Arrival. Obviously, was taking those sort of essential icons of the familiar world and just making them absolutely incomprehensible. And giving that sense of dislocation and sort of strangeness. I just thought was absolutely stunning. I think it's just one of the most eloquent sort of statements of that, that sense of being out of place and being surrounded by the unfamiliar and having to kind of get that, sort of reconnect with that sense of home and redefine what home is to you in the face of an absolutely sort of inscrutable set of systems and structures and processes and
which of course that book was all based on other people's stories, looking at what migrants had written and speaking to people I know who've migrated, and starting with my father and just asking him, so coming from Malaysia to Western Australia to study, what was that like? And it made me appreciate, because I've never migrated anywhere myself, but when I do travel, I get the same feeling I get when I'm doing creative work, and I think this is why people travel too, especially when it's in a culture that's quite different, where you see it's a sudden realization of that your way of living is just one of thousands, and your perception of reality is actually a little bit provisional and arbitrary, because you see all these other people. I love seeing people working in other countries on the street, and that's their normal, but to you it can just look so strange and bizarre, and I love that feeling. I find it's a bit overwhelming actually when I travel. There's almost too much to take in, and interestingly I never draw or paint when I'm traveling.
That is interesting.
I can't do it. It's only when I'm in my own little bubble, my familiar bubble, that I can do those safe explorations and breakdowns and study. And The Arrival was an interesting one to do because it was such a long book, and it was quite a epic sort of, for me, world creation thing that I then had to use that technique over and over again. So what I would do is I'd just get objects, whether it was a tap, like a kitchen tap, and just study it and think, okay, what does it do? And how might it look different? And then pets was another one, because I love looking at pets because they're already a bit weird. And then imagining, well, what if instead of dogs, people had these like giant tadpole things? And it's totally plausible. Like at first, it's one of those ideas, again, it seems stupid and silly. But then the more you think about it, the more plausible it is, it just makes total sense. Like, why not?
Little symbiotic relationship, like.
Yeah. And then applying that to public transport. So what is a bus? So I think about, what does a bus do? How can I have something that does exactly the same thing but looks different? So a lot of the cultural strangeness in The Arrival is actually very superficial. It's just changing the appearance of things. But when you look at what everybody's doing, there's an exact equivalent to things we would do every day.
It's superficial, but it also is, it also is kind of looking at the fundamental underlying truths behind things that we take for granted, and sort of appreciating form and function and the sort of rhythms of every day, and looking at, I think it's really interesting that you say that you can't draw when you travel because of just that overwhelm, and that it's when you come back to your space that you kind of distill it all. It's almost like you have a particular process for, like you said, opening that sort of portal to the subconscious where accidents can happen and associations can be made, and these kind of creative this creative alchemy sort of happens, and I sort of feel like through your work you're actually almost showing people how to do that themselves. It's like you've created this practice that allows you to tap into something bigger and more fundamental than just sort of everyday surface of things and get to the underlying sort of truths, even if you can't define them or pin them down. And I think, you know, that's what your work's doing too, in the way that you leave so much space for people to interpret it. And there's an interesting tension between, on the one hand, you're saying, you know, subjectivity is limiting, and your subjective perception puts boundaries and definitions on things that sort of stops you from seeing them as they sort of are. But then you sort of turn that around and almost use people's subjective perception as a tool, in that they're bringing all those subjective responses to the sort of tensions that you're setting up in your work. And and I know I've seen an interview with you, I think, where you described yourself as being quite sort of selfish and self-absorbed when you're working. But then it also seems like you're really ultimately interested in, you know, the final work as a very collaborative entity. You know, like you want the reader to come in, or the viewer to come in and put their own spin on things.
I think you put that really well, like that, which I never thought about in those terms, but you're right, that I'm sort of pushing against that subjectivity, but then inviting it back in to put meaning back in. It's like you scrape out the vessel, and then it's like, now fill it.
Who knows what?
So that's something I learnt you know, when I started illustrating books, because I came to picture books and other types of illustration as a bit of a novice. I mean, I started doing it before I really knew what I was doing, and I learned along the way, first with science fiction stories and then with children's books. And I came to this realization that your job as a storyteller is really about just providing the minimal furnishings in the room, and then letting the reader be the actor themselves that comes in on that stage, and they fill it with their own experiences. Because everybody looks at I used to think people would look at a picture and they'd see pretty much what I was thinking in terms of the elements and the meanings and so on. And I realized that wasn't the case. Sort of more or less we're on the same page, but we're also seeing things quite differently. And especially talking to kids and hearing their interpretation of pictures, it would really make you realize, okay, there's almost no point putting my personal messages in there, because they're going to be misread anyway. So the thing to do then is to give the space entirely to the reader as much as possible.
Trust.
And to just help them imagine things. So you're just helping the reader to imagine stuff. And writers do this too, probably more effectively than illustrators, because they're just using black specks on a page. They're just helping you to dream. And but the reader is the person that does all the active dreaming. And so that's one of the tricks with illustration, because the very word itself sounds like you're there to hold people's hand and describe a vision for them, which is something that you do. But really all the real meat of a creative work is what's happening in the reader's mind. And The Arrival is another good example. If you actually look at that book, the most interesting things that happen in the gaps between the pictures, between page turns. They're almost like just little stepping stones, but you got to join them up like dots in a dot-to-dot puzzle to actually make the story. And you know, through my own experiments and work over a span of time, because I'll work pretty slowly, and I'll come back and I'll revisit drawings that I might have done months ago, and I have a slightly different take on them. I realize more and more there's different ways of interpreting the same picture, and that you don't want it to be completely open, so it's open to any interpretation, but you want to just keep it pretty generous so that the reader has scope. And another example is The Red Tree and Rules of Summer, which are two books that don't actually have any storyline. It's just pictures and a few sentences, and typically the sentences don't have really much to do with the picture. And so it's really almost saying, being a bit of a lazy writer in a way, saying, okay, here's a starter, and here's the milk, and here's the starter culture. You make the yogurt.
Who knows what
you got to do the work here. And the trick is making that fun enough and interesting enough that's effortless for the reader, that they want to do that. So
and like you said, that comes down to that sense of intrigue, you know, giving them puzzle pieces that are interesting enough to get that mechanism clicking over, where that really human urge to solve the problem and imbue it with meaning and put some sort of, you seem to be quite unsettled about putting boundaries around things, or, you know, rigid frameworks, or you know, like defining things too much, and I guess that's, you know, that's kind of, that comes down to that, leaving that fluidity. But I read a comment where you said sometimes you even are a bit reluctant to, if you've done a painting, you were reluctant to give it a title in case it sort of defined it too much, like right down to the, you know, so it's leaving that sort of, how do you reconcile that with the, I mean, we've talked a lot about the images, but in terms of the writing itself, how do you keep that openness in the writing and that sort of
well, that's the trick, really. Usually my first drafts over describe and explain everything, so and my first sketches do too. It's like I almost like I need to put all my ideas out there before I can take them away. And so, and I quite like that process. It's the brainstorming process, you're just piling stuff on, and it's a massive heap. And then the real sort of more, the more careful creative work is carving it back. So I like the carving, and I think a big part of my work being successful is I'm pretty ruthless carver. Like editors help me be even more ruthless too. Like they'll say, you know, cut the end off this story, or you know, do you really need this picture here? And I've become good at doing that myself. A good example is Cicada, which was originally quite much longer story with all sorts of interesting, I thought very funny episodes of corporate cruelty and bullying and co-workers playing, you know, these heartless practical jokes on this little office bug. And there was this whole thing about him going home, and he had this little apartment, almost a janitor's closet or plumbing wall space, and he just watched nature documentaries, which are all human, so he had to turn the sound off so he could, you know, enjoy them, get rid of the human narration and music to actually see them properly. And he'd be eating his leaves, and he had a little pot plant in his office, and he's protecting his pot plant. And all these are wonderful ideas, but in the end I stripped it all back, and I dumped a lot of that stuff and reduced it down to just real simple images. Got rid of all the other co-workers, so you only see like from the shoulder down. You never see their faces, and it kind of it's a sacrifice that you make, but it meant that the story had more openness to interpretation. So it wasn't anymore just about a funny, you know, sort of Kafkaesque office insect. And it became about, it just becomes, and I noticed in the United States, this was interesting too, maybe because I stripped it down so much, and I didn't really say who the Cicada was, or why he was working there, or why he spoke the way he did, and all this stuff. In the States, a lot of the reviews really commented on immigrant workers, which I wasn't really thinking about that when I did the book. And that this is about, that they really saw the book, this was their interpretation, as being about the plight of immigrant workers and cleaners and those sorts of people who sort of are keeping the economy going, but are not recognised, and often, especially illegal workers. So that was interesting. And probably because I kept the book so lean and spare, it was then possible for those concerns to be brought in. And so that's a good example of how stripping things down can make them bigger.
I think it's also, well, that leads into what I was just about to say. I think it's also a really good example of how even when you strip things out, they're not really gone. Like nothing's wasted, because you know, all of those examples that you just gave of, you know, his little secret life, and his sort of affinity for nature and longing for something beyond, you know, the cubicle and the grey, and the pathos of him as a character with an identity and a personality. I mean, all of those elements that you mentioned that you got rid of are actually still in there.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So they all that, and that's the you know, the iceberg theory of writing, that you build the iceberg, but you only the top part shows poking out of the water, and that's all you need to know. But you know, there's a massive lump of ice there, and I think I first had that intuition about storytelling when I was a kid, and so I was maybe 3 years old when I first saw Star Wars at a drive-in. And it was just, you know, a blurry impression. But as I grew up, and you know, this movie would come on every year on TV. Before you had access to anything on demand, you know, you just have to wait for things to turn up on TV. And, you know, everyone's family would sit around and, you know, Star Wars is going to be on TV, so I'll go and watch that. And we had this tiny Toshiba TV. I mean, literally the screen was this big. Our small color TV, but somehow this film was like enormous in my mind.
Yeah.
And I realized even then that the reason was that it just showed you a tiny little bit of a greater creative work.
And you could sense the whole universe behind it and the world.
Yeah, so one spaceship would whiz by, but it created the illusion that there was a whole big infrastructure behind that, or there'd be one alien pops up and just walks casually in the background. It created the illusion that there's a whole other culture.
Yeah, so that one story sparks 1,000 other stories.
Exactly. And so it created a sense of a universe when, you know, there's not even that many cuts in the film. It's just like, you know, very, very lean. And that's a good approach too. But you still have to build up that stuff. You can't just trick people into thinking that there's something there.
No, like you had to know all of that biographical information about Cicada in order to sort of you know, make that come through as a kind of an atmosphere, or a sort of inchoate, unstated reality just through those images. And I think, like, in doing that, you let sort of visual language do a lot of the heavy lifting for you as well. Like a lot of I mean, Cicada, if we use that as an example, like one of the things that's always struck me about your work is how effectively you use light and to actually convey those sorts of feelings and emotions, and light and color, obviously, but your treatment of light has always, you know, just kind of floored me, the way that you can kind of you know, sort of create an emotion or a sense of dislocation or isolation or abandonment, you know, just through the way you're using light and shadow. And and how much of that is just instinctive and you plugging into the way you feel the image should be, and how much do you consciously work out and plan and experiment?
I think that's a good question, and I'm glad you mentioned the light, because I spend an inordinate amount of time playing around with lights. With Cicada, I actually built the little sets.
I wonder.
And with desk lamps, was constantly, you know, turning on and off different lights and using natural light and trying to sort of create. I think it's instinctive to start with. There's an instinct, and I reckon it comes from both the experience of life and the way you feel at different rooms and seasons and so on. But also cinema has probably played a big role, and theatre and painting. So I love the way, for instance, a lot of old paintings, like old master paintings or doré etchings or so on, are very theatrical. So you'll see the illumination in a Rembrandt. It looks like a stage. It's coming in the middle. So the foreground's dark, the background's dark, and the figures in the center are kind of lit up. And a lot of religious painting is really good at this, creating emotion with light. And so a lot of it is instinctive at first. Like with most drawing, it's instinctive to start with. It's instinctive until it doesn't work.
And then
And
there's
then
a
you're
whole lot
trying
of
to figure
problem
out,
solving to do.
yeah, then you're just thinking, okay, this isn't, it doesn't feel right. So how could it be different? And then I'll play around with alternatives.
So you have that
So,
sense of where you want it to head. It's just a question of the mechanics of how to get it.
yeah, you know, there's like a vague feeling of, you know, what you're trying to get. Sometimes you end up changing course so that you realize, oh, it ended up looking this way. Oh, but that's pretty good, you know, so we'll just go that direction. So I'm still, yeah, I'm still figuring it out. I don't have rules, but and also I get pretty repetitive too, I've noticed, with my lighting effects, because I'm using the same rules. One way I also learn different things is going out and painting. So I do a lot of small paintings. I have these, I've got one here, like these little wooden boards that I paint on, and I just do like local scenes. They're very simple things,
And
but they're all about light.
That's where you started out, wasn't it?
It
like
is, yeah, landscape painting.
Suburban environments and things.
Yeah.
So you still held on to those sort of.
Yeah, it's something I'm good at, because I did it for so long as a teenager.
Yes.
I was first maybe inspired when I was an art student in high school, and they introduced us to Monet, and this idea where he painted haystacks repeatedly at different times of the day.
Those, yeah, in person, stunning.
And they're so different, and they're so emotionally different, you know. When I say emotion, it's not emotions you can name. It's just some kind of nebulous feeling or atmosphere. And even now, Monet is still, his paintings always stand out amongst others. There's some quality of light there that conveys emotion. I'm not quite sure how, but he's able to nail it.
It's almost impossible to pin down, isn't it? The sort of what it is that is resonating. But yeah, it definitely, sort of pushes emotional buttons, and yeah.
And it's interesting how any object can do that, like a haystack.
Yeah, and I think it's it's a pre-verbal response that we have, like they're probably circuits that were set up in our reptilian brain before language was even dreamed of, that we're responding to those sort of stimuli. It feels very kind of very primal, I think. Hard. I think that's why it's so hard to articulate. But your exploration of mediums as well, like you've if we're talking about filmic technique, you've worked on film with The Lost Thing, obviously, and a couple of others. Am I right?
In a roundabout way, I did some early concept art for a couple of animated films. So for Wall-E,
right,
which interestingly, I think Pixar contacted me because they'd seen The Lost Thing, the book,
right,
and they realized that universe was, the color and the atmosphere of a post-ecological world was quite similar to what they were wanting in the first half of that film. And so I just did these paintings of broken freeways and piles of garbage and things like that. It was a lot of fun.
Its way in there.
Yeah, and then that all went to the art and story department, and they developed, along with art from like dozens of other artists, and then they had a really good process of developing story from those kind of crazy visual brainstorming sessions.
Yeah.
And The Lost Thing was the most I've worked with actual filmmaking, working with other animators and digital artists to
it looks like you adopted quite a lot of sort of almost filmic techniques in The Arrival when you're
I was doing it simultaneously, actually.
Right. Oh well, it found its way in, because that's one thing that really struck me, apart from saying obviously you get that sense of the migrant experience and dislocation and really vividly, but one thing that I thought you also did incredibly well was just that you said that a lot of the important things happened outside of the actual action and you had to interpret them, but the way that you handle the passage of time and the sense of distance and journey in, you know, within the pages of a book, in you know, you get this sense of expansiveness and process and things evolving and changing over, you know, space and time. I think there's a sequence where you've just got a flower changing, you know, with I think it's 4 panels, and just the sort of the growth and the petals falling, and you know, and that comes at a really poignant moment in the story where things are changing for the protagonist. And also the journey with just the ship on the ocean. You know, it feels like a series of film shots. And
it's it very much comes from a combination of you know, film experience and comics. So comic artists have to deal with this problem. It's almost more acute in a comic because you know, you've got a very limited page space. You've got you know, this sort of turning action, and you have to sort of show time always, you know, through pictures and the arrangement of pictures on a page. And there's no hard and fast rules for that. It's really about experimenting and seeing what works. And usually the best solutions come from very big problems. So that scene you're describing, up until then, it had been pretty, you know, there's been a number of difficult problems in terms of showing the passage of time, but it was still one thing happens and another thing happens. But then it got to this point where he posts a letter to his family. And I needed to show suddenly that, like, we're not just talking hours now, it's days. But I don't have that much space in the book because I have a physical constraint of 128 pages. That's what the publisher allowed me for the whole project initially. And so, and that was a good constraint, it turned out, because then I got 2 pages that have to show most of the time in the whole book. And how can you do that? And at first it was like lots of little pictures of him doing his domestic chores day after day, going to work, going to language classes, going to doing his laundry and all this sort of stuff. And then the other problem then as an illustrator, because you're just one person doing this whole thing, is like, oh my God, that's going to take forever to draw. Is there a simpler solution?
My hand's going to fall off.
Yeah, and then it's like, of course, he walks past a tree and we're following him, and then as in film that you do, they continue and the camera stays somewhere, and then it's just the tree growing and fruiting, and then there's a secondary opportunity to show the weirdness of the tree because its whole life cycle is quite bizarre. But over time in that book, I think what worked about that book that I was so pleased, and I wasn't sure that it would, is that I wanted the weird culture of the new country to start feeling good towards the end. So because you start seeing the same things over and over, the same trees, the same animals, and after a while the stuff at the beginning that was like, as it would be for any migrant, kind of unsettling and confronting, it starts to feel like home towards the end.
You definitely get that sense,
And I love it when that happens, but it actually takes me a long time to reach that point too, starting to love the world. Well,
it's interesting that you say that. It was good having the sort of restriction of the 128 page format, because I mean, I did wonder whether, I mean, you've experimented with a lot of mediums, but you always seem to give yourself quite definite parameters within that. And I thought it was interesting, you know, that the content of your work's all about sort of eliminating boundaries and opening up possibilities and things. But I wondered, when you're actually producing the work, is it useful to have a sort of a set of rules that govern it, or a certain number of mediums that you use? Or
it is totally. I just found that my best work in different media has happened when I've been constrained. Starting off with the very early work, because the publishers couldn't afford colour production, and there was also some of the reproduction was quite poor quality, like on pulpy paper. And so you then had to do very high contrast artwork, but it made you really think about how to do that. The last thing, the film, we had a 15-minute constraint, which was due to festival entry requirements. And naturally, the animatic, that's the rough version of the film, ran for about 18 or 20 minutes. So we had to crunch it all down. And I'm so glad that we were forced to do so, because it made it more interesting film. We had to cut stuff out.
Do you think that's one of the things that draws you to picture books? Because that's really your first love, isn't it? Is it that sort of spareness and economy and having to find a creative way to solve something with it?
Definitely. It's 32 pages. And it's funny because you always, enter it kind of hating that a little bit, because it's so small. And it's like, oh, I've just mapped it out perfectly. Oh yeah, great. And it's 36 pages. Oh my God. But then you have to, when I'm given too much freedom, to do things, I don't think about them hard enough. I noticed this with theatre productions too, where I've been quite peripheral to some of the adaptations, but I've still been involved. And the adaptations that had a really big budget, they weren't as good as the ones that had almost no budget. And the reason was, I think that the creative talent was the same, but you really had to think harder about what you're doing when you got no money you're trying to convey here. Whereas when you've got infinite resources, you go, hey, let's get a giant fish floating across the stage. Let's do it, But then when you can't do that, it's like, how can we create that? And it just forces you to be rigorous. And it's the same with illustrating a book. And I think the biggest constraint of all, it's not page numbers or reproduction or anything like that, is time. We're all human beings with busy lives, and to actually sit down and illustrate a book takes a ton of time. Right. And there's also limitations about what you can do. We've all only got so much skill and ability. I'm not super good at figure drawing. So if there's a whole lot of figures, I have to figure out a way, how can I show this without having to draw these faces and hands and stuff? And so there's that constant economy of effort and time that leads us to try and find simple ways to convey ideas and come up with better solutions for storytelling.
And I guess also in terms of the reader response as well, and the kind of I was just wondering, speaking of picture books, I was wondering, I saw that Cicada was just in terms of picture books as a genre and how your work works within that. I saw that Cicada was marketed for, is it the 6 to 8 year age group?
Okay.
On a couple of websites, and I just it's interesting that picture books really are the only genre that gives you that kind of spareness and economy and sort of that sort of marriage between image and language. So it seems like I'm really glad that do you feel that more and more there's an adult sort of audience for picture books and sort of an adult readership?
I think so. I think I sort of feel a little bit separated from what's going on at the moment. I used to pay a lot of attention to, everything that was coming out, and then now I feel like I don't know anything. But I have noticed there's a general trend in my career, which started around 1996. That's when I first decided to, illustrate professionally. That there was, I was quite lucky actually. I came in at a time where that was already starting, like in the early 90s. You had some books by writers like Gary Crew that were like weird sort of horror stories for teenagers in a picture book form. And there was some other stuff. There's always been those books, like Raymond Briggs is another one, like When the Wind Blows. You
Mm.
know, elderly couple surviving thermonuclear disaster. I mean, is that a children's book? It's
Gave
just
me nightmares as a child.
yeah. Even his book, The Snowman, it's often, I think, misconstrued as a children's story. I see it as
Mm.
an adult story about childhood memory,
Mm.
not a book about children's experience. And there's always been these books that have been hard to categorize, and they've always just been like the art wanted to exist, but the culture didn't really understand how to integrate it into book sales and libraries and education and so on.
Yeah.
And then in the, you know, throughout the around 2000, there was a really opening up of that, and so you had a lot of teachers and librarians, especially in Australia. I think we were at the forefront of bringing picture books into high schools and even university and studying them
And
as
looking at them as sophisticated visual texts.
yeah. And then you've also had this breakdown of categories between film, animation, comics, picture books, children's and adults, science fiction, fantasy, realist fiction, and
Mm.
you've got this interesting mix of stuff which I feel is approaching something more normal, which is that because all artists have a range of interests. No artist is like, I'm only interested in books for young children,
Mm.
you know, or I'm only interested in this type of painting. Every human being has a spectrum of interests. It's just the society that categorizes them, and that's for commercial reasons usually. So when you say Staccato is 6 to 8, it's just because that's
It's
sort of
got to
familiar.
find a slot for it somewhere.
Yeah, it's a familiar categorization, and I used to worry about it a lot when I started because I knew my books, starting with the rabbits, weren't really for children, and then it caused some confusion and angst.
But actually, I mean, I think your books have gone a long way towards actually, you know, establishing picture books as a, you know, as serious literature, if you like, or sort of, yeah, a genre that has, you know, much more resonance beyond just, you know, picture books for kids. I mean, you've been quite formative in that because you
Yeah.
did break boundaries and you did.
I think it's probably because I was already working across. I've always been working across children's and adult science fiction and fantasy,
Yeah,
and
it's that
um,
cross pollination.
yeah, in the world of science fiction and fantasy, there's less barrier. As a lot of the writers just crisscross, and no one really cares. That's my experience. No one really cares who it's for. No one says, you know, there's almost like a more openness to reading picture books and comics
And I mean, you do that within, I mean, if you look at your body of work as well, you're, I mean, saying that you create picture books is, is sort of, I mean, that's too limiting really, because even in terms of genre bending, even within that medium, you're doing quite unexpected things with the medium. You know, you almost have a, I mean, like for instance, Tales from the Inner City, which I think is your latest book, which is quite extraordinary. I mean, that's basically a short story collection, isn't it, with an image that accompanies each story, but you know, they're very spare, and that's sort of a genre that you've kind of pioneered a little bit, isn't it?
yeah,
Really? And I mean that book, if we're talking about, you know, I mean that's sort of talking about the disconnection between natural and man-made worlds, isn't it? And again, taking those like two worlds that are sort of fractured and don't speak to each other
yeah,
in the way that they should or could or used to, and mashing them together.
yeah,
So it's taking those sort of disparate, unexpected elements and like translocating an animal into a space where you wouldn't expect to see it, which is really powerful. So like in one way, when I read that book, it felt like it felt kind of like the animals had sort of turned up and were insisting on their presence and their right to claim space, you know, to sort of claim that space. But you also made them feel very portentous. They're sort of like harbingers, or it's like they've turned up to give us a message or remind us of something we've forgotten, you know, and it's, you've portrayed them as, you know, their true selves, but they've got this symbolic weight sort of over and above that.
Yeah.
Huh?
Well, yeah, I hadn't really thought about it that way, but you're right. And that the bound I'm interested in artificial boundaries that we set
Mm.
up, I guess. And that goes back to
What
what
hap-
we're saying about genres and books
yeah,
and
what happens when you
reader.
transgress them or do something?
Yeah, and it's really easy to transgress because there's so many artificial
Yeah.
boundaries all over the place. They're they're political, they're social, they're species based. And
Mm.
ever since I was a kid, I remember I was maybe 6, and some teacher said, "Well, there's plants, there's animals, and there's man." People still use that term then. And I thought that doesn't make sense because we just seem to look like another kind of monkey to me. Like, what's the difference? Like, explain. We might be sort of do things a bit differently, but we're animals, right? So that
Mm.
always sort of confused me. And I think I have this feeling, and I probably tapped into it the most with Tales from the Inner City. It's probably the book that I feel is the most condensation of my thinking about the world is in that book.
Mm.
Um, and the older I get, realizing that the categories we set up are kind of delusional. A lot of our society is delusional, and one of the reasons is we're a single species society. And it occurred to me when writing that book, every single thing that's been said, written, painted, etc., has been done by just one species talking to itself and representing the entire cosmos through the lens of its own eyes. We haven't had the privilege of actually having a good conversation with whales.
Well, that's interesting, because one of the things that I was thinking when I was reading that book is like, one of the things you're doing is presenting the animals exactly as they are in all their glory. They're just very much, like when they're, I keep thinking of the owl in the hospital room, because that one really spoke to me at the time. you know but and celebrating the fact that they exist and they have an identity and they have their own sort of reality.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we as humans can't help attributing this kind of allegorical meaning to them, or
Yeah.
some sort of
Yeah.
symbolism beyond themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad you say that, because that was sort of haunting me the whole time when doing the book, was this central paradox of trying to sort of assert the independent nature of animals while at the same time totally bending them to the service of my stories.
Yeah. And knowing you're going to have a host of readers that are going to come in and interpret the heck out of
Yeah,
them.
yeah. But then I figured that's fine, because that's what I come to this conclusion with almost every book I do. There's always some representational paradox in any art form, and you come to the conclusion that that's fine, because what you are doing in doing this creative work is you are exploring that paradox. You're presenting it, so it's not resolved.
Yeah.
You're like examining that difficult human condition. But I was very careful in that book to avoid anthropomorphism.
Mm.
And interestingly, cicada was originally a story in that book, and it bothered me so much because the cicada is an anthropomorphic story, and it has to be. So I ended up like splitting them into two different books, because they just didn't belong together. It wasn't an animal being itself; it was an animal being something else. Although it becomes itself in the end. So yeah, I still struggle with the conceptual dilemmas of Tales from the Inner City, but I feel that's so much a sign of our times.
Well, it really encapsulates the entire sort of issue, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How do we reconcile,
Yeah. How do we think about
nature
non-human things?
Yeah. And
It's
do
almost-
we need to rethink the way that we think about them?
Yeah, yeah.
You know.
And I guess the conclusion, because not all the stories are negative. So the main conclusion, I think I came closest with the parrot story, because I live with a parrot. And what started out as thinking that I knew the animal, over 22 years has become, I love the animal, but I don't understand it at all. And there's nothing wrong with that. As long as we respect each other. And so I think that's become the key realization in doing that book, is that you don't need to understand or subjugate the animal into the human consciousness. You just have to respect its difference and strangeness.
That almost sounds like a bit of an instruction manual for how to respond to your work as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think the picture books are great too in sorting out good readers from bad ones. Because the bad reader, and I am guilty of looking at Goodreads reviews sometimes, and I love seeing people's comments, and especially the negative ones, because it's usually people don't do 2 stars or 3 stars, it's 1 star or no stars. And I love those ones because you can see it's a person who's it's not that they don't like the book, they haven't taken time to understand.
Well, they don't have the right tools to kind of
so they want something that they're making the mistake of seeking recognition, which is not what we do when we read. We don't seek recognition. We're seeking something we don't recognize so that we can have a little puzzle to think about. And for some people, that puzzle is a bit too, especially in a visual form, can be a bit too much. And then it becomes a bit annoying. So, which I understand. But the good reader is the person who will make an effort to look at things on their own terms, rather than projecting their desires and judgment onto something. Which you find with a lot of children's stuff. You have to, I like children's literature because you do have to reserve your own impressions as an adult, because otherwise you'll say, oh, that's childish.
I thought it was interesting that you kind of look at the state of being a child as a kind of a cultural state.
Yeah.
Yes. With its own cultural sort of associations and I guess different cultures for different age groups and things.
Different times, different ages. But like, say, the world of 8-year-olds in 2022 in Australia, in the East Coast, is a particular culture.
Very niche.
And I see it in my own kids. And I'm reminded of how it was for me. And I was aware of it when I was in school, and I would see the way parents and teachers would present us things. And I would also see that they don't get this stuff the way my friends do. They're not seeing the same things. There'll be some fad or something, and the parents will be like, oh, very disappointed in it. You're not tuned into our culture. You don't understand our language here. And it's not a verbal language. It's a language of sensory experience and jokes and visual things that kids will understand. And it's hard to communicate. So therefore the cultures remain separate and a bit distant from each other, because we can't, and kids can't write an academic essay about it. They don't have the tools to do that. But it's definitely a deep, rich, intelligent culture in all stages of childhood. And that's very difficult for adults, including myself, to access. But you have to trust that it's there,
And trust that they're going to children are very capable of sophisticated emotional responses to material.
Yeah, which they can't articulate necessarily, but it's all happening. It's all happening in there.
Yeah. Well, I think we've actually run over time, because if I had my way, I'd just keep you here for a week.
A lot of fun talking to you.
Yeah, it's been lovely. It's been an absolute delight. And I just quickly, I know you've got something you're working on at the moment, which is a new book, which is a collection of sketch material and a sort of an aggregation of bits and pieces that didn't quite seem to fit the universes of any of the other books.
A little bit, yeah, like the widows and orphans of other projects, but also just my personal work. I got a advanced Spanish copy of it.
Oh wow!
Spaniards are pretty quick.
So that's
a first look at it. So it's called Creature, and it's it's a pretty hefty volume of just some text and images, very much about the stuff we're talking about here. The relationship between fiction and reality, and I start off with a drawing that I did when I was 3 of some dinosaurs, and reflecting on the fact that I haven't actually changed. I'm still doing the same, like that was work experience.
Just been building on that ever since.
Yeah, and it's like, why do I keep coming back to creatures? I'm just trying to be honest about my practice. I've gone through many phases as an artist of, different levels of academic pretentiousness and high art, low art, working in different areas. And I'm approaching 50, and I sort of look back on all the stuff and I think, well, honestly, where have my passions been? And it's been sort of landscape painting and drawing funny creatures, and I don't know why. If I'm going to be really honest, I don't really know why, but I just keep coming back to that again and again. Like when I'm got a sketchbook and there's a blank page, I draw some funny 4-legged thing and horns, and then I start to build up a story around it, and sometimes it makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. And so this book is really an exploration of that impulse, which I think all children have, but then what happens when you take it through 50 years of your life continuously doing the same thing? Where can you go with something that seems so silly at first?
So it very much fits in with that, what we were talking about at the beginning, where it starts off as a sort of personal exploration of what sort of sparks you in life and what interests you, and then becomes this sort of universal thing that's going to resonate with.
Yeah, and I think the moral of the whole thing is draw first and ask questions later. And I'm asking the questions now, but all of the work is very from the heart that way. It's just especially in this book, just work that I did, especially the unpublished paintings, just because I really wanted to see what that looks like. I don't know why. I just want to.
So I'm just interested to know when something like that hits you, is it kind of a compulsion to create, to see it through to the end? It
is. At first, it's not. I'm a slow starter.
So you sort of have to force yourself to begin.
A little bit, yeah. I have to make the time. I make the time and I have the list. This is a good idea. Maybe I should do, and then I get started. But once I get started, it's like like any puzzle. Once you get involved, then I really do feel like I need to see it through to the end. And I think that's one of the reasons I've had a successful career, is that I can't stop. Even when it's insanely taxing and unprofitable, I will still keep doing it until it's finished. I really want to see the thing finished. I want to see it resolved.
Be a tangible result. I mean, the irony,
even if I never show it to anybody, just for myself, I want to know where it's going.
But the irony of you not knowing where to stop is, I think, part of what makes your work so good, is you do know when to pull back,
when to quit. That's something I've gotten better at. The younger artist always overworks, and I see that in a lot of my early stuff. And then as you relax into creating artwork and you see it more as a process, I think that's what maturity is understanding things as more process than product.
Yeah. And
it doesn't have to be good. That's a really key realization as you develop. Then things become good. Once you stop trying, and you just sort of listen honestly and trust your instincts. But you got to develop them first. Unfortunately, that's the hard part. But then it's nice. I still struggle a lot, but I have some trust in my instincts that if my hand says put a blue patch there, I'll just do it. And if it's wrong, who cares? So that's helped me a lot. to survive doing some of the longer projects too, without getting overwhelmed or bored by just feeling
Paralyzed, yeah.
yeah, which is a big problem that we all have.
Well, on an end note, this is a good way to segue into this, but I've got one last question that I'd like to ask you, Richard. When you are in the flow, like when you've managed to force yourself to start and you're working through your ideas and you kind of, you were talking about, almost unlocking another part of your brain where you manage to access that other universe that doesn't exist when you're feeding the parrot or doing the shopping. So when you're in that space, sitting in your studio and you're mid-flow, if your mind was a physical space that you could walk into and explore and look around, what sort of space would you be standing in?
It would be well, it's funny you say that, because I was thinking about this recently. The image that comes to mind when I'm working, and it's probably because I have so little time to do it, with family life and all the other things that life throws at you. But especially in the studio, it would be like some sort of deep sea coral reef. Because it feels like when you do get into that zone that you're describing, which happens after you sort of built up enough material and thought that there's a critical mass, and it starts to generate by itself. It's like two halves of uranium come together and it's starting to now produce its own energy. It's like the desk opens up into a little pool and you put on your diving suit. That's all the equipment that you've gathered, skills and everything and experience. And then you go down, down, down into this deep place. And I used to work, I don't anymore, but I used to work very effectively in the hours between about 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. And it was black outside, no one was going to ring or call. And it felt like I was removed from the universe, the real universe, and I was deep diving. And a lot of the arrival was actually drawn in that time, sort of the deep dive. You got enough. Deep dive can't be short. You need that time, but you also have to be careful, because you can get decompression sickness and all sorts of other things can go wrong. But yeah, it's a good question. But I would say it feels like sort of this deep dive. And it has to be fairly organized for that reason. So you have to have the time and the space. It's not something you can do flippantly or spontaneously. You have it all set up. At least for me, it can't be too chaotic. It has to be an organized deep dive. Then you can have fun in the coral reef and look at all the little fish and
that's a perfect analogy. You've got some shadowy, expansive, mysterious world with all these intriguing little creatures.
Yeah. I mean, that's
and a few vast beasts lurking in the background.
That's right. Big ones will loom overhead. They're a bit indistinct, but you're trying to sketch them quickly with your underwater pad. Yeah.
Oh, that's brilliant. Well, thanks so much, Shaun. It's been an absolute pleasure. And when can we expect to see Creature in Australia?
In October.
Brilliant.
Published by Windy Hollow Books.
Well, I know what I'm getting myself for Christmas. All right.
Okay, great talking to you.
Bye, Shaun.
Thanks. See you.